Certainly one of my memories from a couple of different places in Spokane. If you'd all please rise, we'll sing the first hymn today as part of the service, which will be My Shepherd Will Supply My Needs. And I'm reminded by my mother that this was actually Grandma Audrey's favorite hymn. She requested this to be sung today. Very beautiful. Back to ball.
Now we have two more rounds of memories and thoughts. And Sharon, I think you're first on the agenda.
Good morning, everyone. Well, Ashley and Paula covered my earliest memories of Grandma, which was life on the farm. And I think that was one of the highlights of my childhood, was going to the farm. And it was because I think if I had to sum it all up, we knew we would be well fed and well loved. A few additional memories that weren't covered. Ashley, you and I would sometimes pack lunches and go to the creek. We would play in the loft in the barn. There was a wonderful black lab named Jessie that we adored petting and playing with. And we did not have a dog at our house. We always played with other people's dogs. And Jessie, I kind of felt like was my first dog, even though I only petted her at 4th of July and Thanksgiving for the first 10 years of my life. They also had a horse named Misty that was black with a white star, and we got to ride that horse, and that was so special. And Grandma almost always lived in Missouri, but for 6 years, when I was in high school, she lived in Spokane, and that was the time my brother Dave and I remember her coming to lots of games. We played sports. She came to all my basketball games, and she had played basketball when that meant 6 people on a court in Iowa. By the time I played, there were only 5 girls, and we ran the whole court. But I think what was really special was a lot of grandparents came because they loved their grandchild, but they didn't know much about the sport or care that much about it. Grandma loved March Madness. She knew all about the sport. And it was really special to have that shared interest and, of course, the food. And my own children now, we came to Thanksgiving here a couple years as Brendan's and my 4 children were growing up, and they loved the food and they loved being loved. The same way. Are they doing Thanksgiving at Missouri this year? When are we going again? We loved that. We've missed that. I hope there can be some form of that again because that was so very special. I want to touch on 3 things that I really love about Grandma that have been touched on as well too, but she shared with me that in one of the studies she participated at the local university, there was some kind of intake interview, and they asked her the question, do you think you can do things as well as other people? And she was sharing this with me, and she just laughed and said, oh, I never thought about it. And I just love that because we know she was so good at so many things, but she just didn't focus on feeling inferior or superior to anybody. She just did what she did with great joy, and I think that is such a wonderful example that I hope to have that same do your best, but don't worry about where you rank. And I just love that about her. And I think she set that beautiful example for a whole clan of people who are very talented and very good at many things. But as I think back to all the conversations and hearing about all the interesting things people are doing and achieving and just excelling in, it's never one of arrogance in this family. And I love that so much and always find that so refreshing and exciting. A second quality I really admired in Grandma is her cheerfulness. And while we didn't live near her for most of our growing up, she often traveled with our family in the fall. And we went to a number of cities across the U.S. We also went to Europe and to the Middle East and to Canada and Mexico. And as anyone who has traveled knows, it's very exciting. But sometimes there are also delays and disappointments, and there are things that can try one's patience. And Grandma was ever cheerful, and she just made it seem so normal. And I didn't really know until I grew up that wasn't normal. And I so appreciate, I remember one time when I was a teenager, we were in Germany looking for little signs that said Zimmer frei, which meant somebody had a room they would rent that night. And on this trip, it was my father's parents, my mom and dad, my brother and me, 3 grandparents, 2 parents, 2 children in this little white van, driving through Germany looking for rooms. And apparently there was a boating festival we didn't know about. And this was long before the internet or anything, and we kept looking for rooms, and it was taking hours, and we didn't know if we would find beds that night. And Grandma was just so cheerful. I mean, you would have thought we were on a boat ride. And we did find rooms. I just remember her spirit and attitude more than anything else from that night. Fast forward a couple, maybe decade, I was married. Brendan and I had Joe, who's now very big, but he was 2. David was 6 months, and Grandma traveled with our family to France in the fall. The trip took 22 hours. Our luggage caught up to us 3 days later. And once again, Grandma's just cheerfulness and attitude about, oh, what an adventure. This was so welcome and wonderful because as a young mother, I was tired and it wasn't that fun, and there was plenty that we could have focused on being disappointed and sad about. But instead, she was cheerful. It helped us all. We look back now at the pictures and say, what a wonderful trip. But I do remember it didn't feel wonderful at first. So I think her cheerfulness, we don't really hear that a lot upheld as a virtue, but I actually think what it does, we hear about grit, and there's a big TED Talk out there about what makes people gritty, what makes them stick with things and do hard things. And I actually think her cheerfulness is a very important part of what fuels one's ability to stick with things when they're hard, when they're difficult, and she did that so beautifully. And lastly, and most importantly of all, Grandma taught me about beauty. As we've already heard, yes, what an impeccable dresser. I have to admit that when I was younger, I was a bit cynical about beauty. And I think it was sometimes because I saw such a gap between someone's appearance and their substance. And that caused me to kind of undervalue beauty or say it didn't matter or something. And Grandma's example was such a powerful argument against my error, because I think she showed how ennobling and encouraging and inspiring it is when someone's presentation and their substance are both rich and deep and beautiful. And just her presence made everything better. Beauty wasn't an add-on, it wasn't shallow, it wasn't meaningless. It was more like the glue that held it all together. Whether it was a beautiful table, or a beautiful outfit, or beautiful words as she was listening and caring about you and encouraging you. And so I just feel like Grandma was someone who encouraged me and everyone around her. I know no one can please everyone, but it almost feels like Grandma did, because she knew so many people from living so many places. Some knew her very well, some knew her very little, but universally, I heard people say she was beautiful, she was classy, she was gracious, and she was always welcome. And those are things I just think she lived and worked and rested and died. She did everything beautifully. And I hope, I know we all value those things, and I hope we all carry on that legacy by continuing to feed people well and love them well. And I think that truly is an answer to a great many of our problems today. Love you, Grandma.
And representing the family of the youngest sibling, Ethan visited.
I am one of Audrey's many grandchildren. And I have the unique position of being the youngest, eldest grandchild. Although I often bear some amount of discomfort with social events, there's nothing that I would rather be doing today than contributing to the celebration of life for my grandmother. I usually prefer to speak somewhat extemporaneously, but some things are important enough to write down. To allow yourself the precision that comes from extensive forethought to say what you mean, and to let the early thoughts stew long enough to really mean what you say. Events like this one, although nominally for the one that we remember, are really for the rememberers. They're for the living. Our lives are built from long periods of ordinary interactions with those who are closest to us, and we punctuate those stretches in big groups by celebrating new arrivals, witnessing new unions, and meeting a bit more soberly to honor those who are no longer with us. And over the past several weeks, I've had time to consider at length what I can keep and learn and cherish from the life of Audrey Goodrich. Most of my memories of Audrey are very childish ones. My recollections of a loving grandmother who made tasty desserts and enthusiastically witnessed my inexpert piano performances are certainly very precious to me. But they're also not particularly unique. Every grandmother knows when to clap and how to smile and what the application of a little sugar at the right time can do, even if my grandma did it better than most. There are certainly very good lessons from the very good times, but I only have a few minutes, and I want to use them to their greatest effect. And the greatest lesson I learned from my grandmother came by watching her live not through the idyllic stretch of my youth, but later in the less halcyon days. My adulthood had me coming into a world that she was simultaneously receding from. And it's not with despair, but great admiration and gratitude that I say that Audrey showed me how to age well in the face of that inevitable diminishing. No one makes it to 99 years old without experiencing all the pains and indignities that life has to offer. The loss of loved ones and relationships and the inevitable betrayal of one's own body, the loss of autonomy. We can never really control what specific mix of misfortunes will come to balance out the high points in our life. What we can control is how we respond to them. And it's my sincere hope that I will always make the choice that my grandmother did and choose to continue to love well. We can instead, if we choose, take every hardship as an insult. We can allow the unfairness of it all to embitter us and to become resentful to those around us that we see less burdened. We can blame and reject and even ignore the presence of those challenges and the people around us trying to comfort and support us. And having spent years as an emergency responder, I'm all too intimately familiar with the rage and frustration and bitterness that can accompany the entropic devolution of the human body. And I've come to suspect that throughout our lives, we're forming habitual reactions, default responses and patterns of the ways that we think of ourselves and the way that we treat other people. Sometimes, in moments when the normal lucidity isn't close to hand anymore, those habits are all that's still there. What does it say about our prior lives if we are habitually filled with rage and bile? Those are certainly not the habits revealed in the life of Audrey. She was in every experience that I can recall, hopeful and unerringly kind to those around her, even in moments when she could no longer be clever or quick. The hope was just built in by that point, I think. Don't mistake me when I use the word hopeful, which sometimes can be used pejoratively to indicate naivety or self-delusion. Grandma was not blind to reality. I recall one moment that I hope will stay vivid in my mind throughout my life when, in her living room, as my mother and aunt were discussing some of her recently worsening health problems, she could hear the concern in their voices, and she looked over at me in the midst of their strategizing and whispered, almost conspiratorially, "It sounds bad, but I think age may have something to do with it." If we are lucky, we will all grapple with the reality of an aging body. One day, my hands won't grasp what they once manipulated easily. At 35, I already have my complaints. I might be unable to lift a child, or to cook a meal, or to play a tune on the piano. My eyes won't see as clearly, and my conversation will slow, and my memory might fade. Bit by bit, one settles for being supported and cared for by those for whom we once provided the support. Would it be surprising at all if one became resentful as they were slowly deprived of each of those elements of their lives?